So, Esther, like I said, it's a bit of a shame. It's been quite disruptive because we've had 2 weeks off since the last time we were looking at this, and we didn't quite finish chapter 6. And then we're on today, and then we're off again next week. But then we'll meet the 2 weeks after that up until cultivate. Let's see how far we get. Okay, but I wanted to finish chapter 6. So, if you remember where we're at, everybody's pretty much been here, right? You kind of know what's going on. So, Esther's queen, Jew, Haman, prime minister, whatever, of the Persian Empire, is angry with Mordecai, another Jew, and he decides the right way to deal with his anger is to basically annihilate the entire Jewish race. It's a bit extreme, but that's where we are. He goes to Xerxes, asks Xerxes for permission to write this decree that basically allows, in 11 months' time, everybody, all the Persians, to basically kill any Jews they can find and take their property. So Mordecai finds out about this, tells Esther, you need to speak to the king. You need to plead for our lives. And Esther says, no. Why? Because she didn't want to die. Yeah, she says, that's crazy. If I go to the king, he hasn't asked to see me in a month. If I just show up there, I could be executed. And he says to her, you've actually got nothing to lose. Like, you're going to die. If you don't speak to the king, you're going to die. You may as well just go and speak to the king. And maybe you'll be spared. So anyway, so she says, okay, fine. And so she gets everybody to pray and to fast for her for 3 days. And then she goes to see the king. And the king raises his scepter, which means mercy, grace, allows her to approach. And says, what do you want? I'll give you anything you want. What do you want? And she says, yeah, come, you and Haman, come and join me for a banquet. And so he says, okay. And so they do. They go and have a banquet with Esther. And at the end of the meal, he says, why are we here? You didn't risk your life to come before me to invite me to dinner. What are we doing here? And she says, another banquet. Come again tomorrow. Come for another banquet tomorrow, then I'll tell you what this is all about. Okay. So Haman goes home. He's in a great mood, right? He's just had this special privilege of being invited to a banquet just with the king and the queen, and he's feeling great. But on his way out the palace, he sees Mordecai. And Mordecai doesn't bow to him, doesn't show him any respect, doesn't even look scared of him. And it infuriates Haman. So he goes home, collects up all of his friends and says, well, boasting to them about like how great his life is and how privileged he is. But he's like, despite all that I have, I'm not satisfied as long as I have to see that Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. And so his friends and his wife tell him, build a humongous gallows to hang him on. Yeah, tomorrow morning, build a big gallows, and we said there's probably an impaling stick, a very, very long one. Set that up in the morning, go see the king and ask him if you can execute Mordecai. And then you can go to the queen's banquet tomorrow and enjoy it, because Mordecai's gone. And that was chapter 5. Chapter 6 came that night. What happened?
The king couldn't sleep.
The king.
So he asked the eunuchs to read him the Chronicles.
The king can't sleep, so he asks his servants to read him the Chronicles of the Kings, which is kind of boring for the most part. And it just so happened that the part of the Chronicles, the history, the Persian history that the eunuchs read to him, tells him what?
How Mordecai saved the king by pointing out some people who wanted to kill the king.
Yeah, that about 5 years ago, this guy called Mordecai, a Jew, saved your life. He found out about this plot to assassinate you, and he told you, and your life was spared. And so then the king's like, well, great, what did I do to reward him? And he's told, nothing. You didn't give him any reward at all. Just then, Haman arrives. Why is he there?
To ask the king if he can hang Mordecai.
To ask the king if he can execute Mordecai. But before he says that, the king says, hey, Haman, what should I do for somebody that I want to honor? And Haman says,
who would the king want to honor more than me?
he must be talking about me. And so he says, I think you should dress him in clothes that you yourself have worn, put him on a horse that you yourself have ridden, and one of your important nobles should lead him through the city saying, this is a king, this is a man that technically it's like, this is how, what is it? So shall be done to a man the king wants to honor, or something. Basically saying, this is somebody the king wants to honor. And so the king says, great, do that to Mordecai, for Mordecai, because he saved my life. And so, as you can imagine, shame. Haman has to go and dress Mordecai in all these things and parade him through the streets. And then afterwards it said that was where we got up to. At the end, Mordecai goes back, sits at the king's gate. He's still in mourning. He's still stressed about what's happening in now, I think, about 8 months' time. Nothing's changed, but Haman is just humiliated. And so he covers his face as though he's mourning and runs home. When he gets home, he finds his wife and his friends there. Why do you think his friends are there?
To ask what the king said.
Yeah, to find out what's happened. And I suspect probably, because we find out kind of in chapter 7 that this big impaling pole was basically at Haman's estate. It was in his backyard. And so I think they were probably there to watch Haman execute Mordecai. But instead, Haman tells them what happened. And then it says, these wise men, along with his wife Zeresh, said to him, if indeed this Mordecai before whom you have begun to fall is Jewish, you won't prevail against him. You are surely going to fall before him. And we said that was quite interesting, like that it's if he's Jewish, you're in trouble. If he actually is Jewish. And that's kind of strange, right? Who cares whether he's Jewish? What is his ethnicity? What relevance is that to Haman having victory over Mordecai? It's irrelevant, right? Why would it matter whether or not he's Jewish?
Because the Jews are God's chosen people.
It's because of their God, right? And so I said, this is another place where you kind of have God hidden in the story. Not obviously so, but he's there. The reason they recognize that Haman is going to fall to Mordecai is because they recognize that Mordecai's God is for real. Yeah. So, okay, so that's what we got up to. But I said there's a comment in here that's quite interesting that I wanted to look at a little bit. It says, these wise men, or technically his wise men, Haman's wise men, along with his wife, said this. And it could be that they're called wise simply because they show wisdom in what they've just said, in recognizing that if Mordecai's Jewish, Haman's in trouble. That's possible. That's probably the simplest explanation, is that it's just saying these were wise men. But there is another possibility that's kind of interesting. The word that's translated wise is chacham. It's a verb, it means to be wise. And the plural of that is, well, okay. What was I going to say? Yeah. It's this word chacham. That's the same word as back in Genesis when Pharaoh has a dream and he needs wise men to come and interpret his dream. Or he needs, it's like his magicians and advisors and stuff. It's the same word, chacham. It's also when the later Pharaoh, when Moses goes before Pharaoh and he's doing he's throwing his stick down and it's turning into a snake, and it says that Pharaoh got his magicians to do the same thing. It's the same word, chacham. And then if you remember in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream and he calls all of his wise men to interpret the dream, and they can't. But then Daniel comes and interprets the dream. And then it says that the king elevated Daniel to a high position and bestowed on him many marvelous gifts. He granted him authority over the entire province of Babylon and made him the main prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. That word in this case is plural, chachim. It's the same word, right? Daniel was put in charge of all of the chachim. Yes? Okay, that is the Hebrew word for what in Babylon and Persia and the Median empires was a priestly class within their society who were the teachers, the priests, the doctors, the astronomers, the astrologers, and the magicians. They were called the chacham, yeah, in Hebrew. But in Greek, the name is magos, or in plural, magoi, or magi. And that these magi are like referenced throughout ancient Greek literature. And so you have a guy called Apion of Alexander, and he wrote that as to those in India, Alexander interrogated the Brahmins who seemed to be the astronomers and learned men of that country, like the Magi among the Persians. So the Magi were the astronomers and learned men, yeah? And then there's a guy called Strabo who wrote this huge encyclopedia called Geography around about 23 AD. And he writes that the Council of the Parthians, according to Posidonius, consists of two groups. One, that of kinsmen, and the other, that of wise men and magi, from both of which groups the kings were appointed. And so basically what we understand here is that in the Parthian Empire, which we'll talk about in a sec, the kings were appointed from, there were two groups. There were the kinsmen. What does the word kinsman mean? Family, kin, right? So these are descendants of the kings. Yeah? Physically related to the kings. That was the one group. And then the other group were these wise men and magi. And that the kings of the Parthian Empire were selected from the kinsmen by the magi. And so they were a very, very powerful and important force within the Persian, Parthian, Babylonian empires. They essentially appointed the next king. They were the kingmakers. Yeah? Now, the Parthian Empire was the successor of the Persian Empire. So after Alexander the Great died and the Greek Empire broke up, the Parthians arose in what was Persia. So it's Iraq, Iran, part of Syria, a bunch of countries, a very big empire. And apparently the kings in the Parthian Empire were chosen by the Magi. Okay. And so it's possible that these wise men of Haman were Magi. They were part of the Magi of Persia, which is interesting. Now, that word Magi, is it familiar?
Magic.
The three wise men. Matthew 2. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, in the time of King Herod, Magi in Greek, from the east, from Parthia, came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the one who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." And when King Herod heard this, he was alarmed, and all of Jerusalem with him. And so after Jesus was born in Bethlehem, near Jerusalem, these Magi came from the east, from Parthia. How many were there? What does it say?
Plural. Doesn't specify.
Yeah, it doesn't tell you how many. Basically, there were 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so it makes like a nice picture to have one king each holding one of the gifts. And so there's 3. But it doesn't actually tell us how many came. It could have been all of them. It could have, and it says that when Herod found out that these Parthian Magi had come to Jerusalem, he and all of Jerusalem freaked out. And that's because Parthia was a rival empire to the Roman Empire. So you have like these leaders from your rival, from your enemy empire arrive in Jerusalem. And it's very unlikely that 3 random guys would have come on their own. Most likely, if you're sending these important people from your empire to an enemy empire, they're going to come with a whole army escort, right, to protect them. And there were very likely more than 3 of them. And they show up in Jerusalem. Now, what are they there to do? They say, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews?" They're looking for a king. Don't miss the importance of that. Like, who were the Magi in the Parthian Empire? What did they do?
They proclaimed the next king.
They appointed the next king, and they're here looking for a king, which is kind of cool. The question is, how did these Magi from Persia, Parthia, Babylon, know what to look for? Like, they are astronomers. That was one of the things that the Magi were, so they understood the stars. But how did they know which star to follow and when, do you reckon?
A lot of drawing.
Probably be pretty obvious if there was a massive star there that wasn't there the day before.
But if there was a massive star there that wasn't the day before, wouldn't lots of people have followed it?
Lots of people weren't astronomers. Lots of people probably.
I think I would follow it.
If you like going home tonight, you look up and saw a massive star, you follow it.
Not now.
Who did Nebuchadnezzar put in charge of the wise men in Babylon? The Magi. Elevated Daniel, a Jew, to be in charge of all the Magi in Babylon. And so it's at least possible that Daniel told them about this coming king, and maybe told them when and where to look for him. Remember, Daniel, we've looked at that, the 69-week prophecy, that pretty much to the day tells them when Jesus is coming. That was Daniel. So he may have had some insight into this, and may have been part of the reason why the Magi showed up in Jerusalem to see this king. Anyway, so don't know, but it's possible that Haman's friends were part of that priestly class, the Magi. And then it says, while they were still speaking to him, telling him, "You're in trouble," the king's eunuchs arrived. The king's servants arrived, and they quickly took Haman to the banquet that Esther had prepared for him. Good timing. How do you think Haman was feeling at this point? Yeah, it's probably the last thing he wanted to do, was go to this banquet with the queen. Okay. Now, one last thing I wanted to comment on in this chapter is that we know all that's going on here with Haman and with his plans for Mordecai and all of that. But I think, to me, seems fairly obvious that Esther and Mordecai had no idea what was going on. Esther's worrying about this banquet, getting everything ready, and how she's going to speak to the king about this problem in 8 months' time. Mordecai has just had to put up with this probably frustrating day with this guy that he hates, who's had to take him through the city and all this stuff and dress him and all that kind of thing. So he's not happy about it. And he's, again, also, his mind is what's happening in 8 months' time. I don't think either of them have any idea how significant that morning had been. The events, the fact that the king couldn't sleep, the fact that Haman arrived at that moment and had to walk Mordecai through the city. That if it hadn't been for that series, remember we looked at about 5 coincidences that morning. If it hadn't been for that series of coincidences, Mordecai would have been dead that morning, Which I think is really cool, and it's such a great picture of our lives and of the lesson that the story of Esther is designed to teach us. In the book of Proverbs, it says that a person plans his course, but the Lord directs his steps. That's us, and that's Esther and Mordecai, right? We're making our plans, going about our day, getting frustrated when things don't go the way that we want them to. But meanwhile, it's God who's in the background there directing the steps, actually putting things together to drive us in the direction that He ultimately wants us to go. But for the most part, that directing is invisible to us, at least at the time. God's working silently in the background, hidden from our view, just like He is here for Esther and Mordecai, who again are busy going about their day, dealing with the things that they've got to deal with. God in the background is saving Mordecai's life, and they have no idea, which I think is kind of cool. Yeah. It's only, I think, when we look back at our lives, and you will find this in your life, either later in your life or certainly from eternity, I think, is when we're going to look back and we're going to see how all these coincidences are orchestrated by God, were orchestrated by God to bring about His purpose in our life. And as it says in Romans, that it's God working all things together for good, even the sucky things, just in the lives of those that He loves. So that's Esther 6, which brings us to Esther 7. Cool. Who wants to read verses 1 and 2?
So the king and Haman came to dine with Queen Esther, and on the second day at the banquet of wine, the king asked Esther, "What is your request, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. And what is your petition? Ask for up to half of the kingdom, and it shall be done."
So, second banquet. I imagine that Haman probably at this one was a lot less talkative than he might have been at the first one. May have been a somewhat somber affair. But again, the king asks Esther now a third time, "What's this all about? What do you want?" Ask up to half the kingdom and it will be done to you. I think that's, what would you say? Brain's a bit slow this morning. But yeah, it's not literal. It's like just an idiom or something like that, But, sorry?
Hyperbole?
Well, it is hyperbole, yeah. But just basically saying I'm going to give you pretty much anything you want, so just tell me what's up. And so then Esther replied. And if you remember, again, like in the last chapter, if Esther basically said, "Next time I'll tell you. Next banquet, so here we go. She's finally going to ask the question that we've been waiting 3 chapters for her to ask. Verses 3 and 4.
Then Queen Esther answered and said, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition and my people at my request. For we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy could never compensate for the king's loss."
I think it's quite an epic response from Esther. She says, "If I've met with your approval, O king, and if you're inclined, grant me my life." He's like, "What do you want?" He has no idea what's going on, like what she's going to ask for. And what does she ask for? My life. Grant me my life and the life of my people. And you can imagine he's like, "What are you talking about?" And then the rest of this, you can't imagine a more gracious and humble response from her. She says, For we have been sold, both I and my people, to destruction and to slaughter and to annihilation. If we had simply been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have brought this up to you. Like, it wouldn't have been worth your trouble. But it's because we are actually being sold to death. And that was quite a literal sale, because Haman had offered the king 10,000 talents of silver to do this, right? There's probably quite a lot to be said, and the Bible certainly says quite a lot about the importance of our words and the way that we speak. And I don't want to get too sidetracked with that this morning, because I got well sidetracked by it when I was doing my studies during the week. But we'll look at a few key verses. In the book of Proverbs, it says, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those who love its use will eat its fruit." I think it's quite funny, like, put together. But the point is, our words, apparently, according to this proverb, have the power of life and death. You can't get much more serious than that, or significant than that, right? Words are powerful. That was certainly true for Esther in this case, but it's also a warning for us that the words that we use, words have meaning, and they can have a powerful impact on our lives and on the lives of the people around us. And apparently, the more you talk, the more you're going to enjoy the fruit of the things that you say. Those who love its use will eat its fruit, whether good or bad. And generally in the book of Proverbs, we're encouraged to speak less, not more. There's a proverb that I really like, and no, I haven't got it here, that says, like, even a fool will be thought wise if he keeps his mouth shut, which I've found to be true. Anyway, so again, our words have meaning. They're powerful. They can bring death and life. That can be physical death and life, but I'm sure you guys are quite well aware from your experiences at school and other places that the words that people use can cause a lot of distraction in the lives of people around or in your own. And they have the power to actually build up and to encourage and to bring life in situations, you know? Now, Jesus said something quite interesting, something that surprised the people who were listening to him. For context, the Pharisees taught that before you could eat anything, you had to wash your hands in a particular way. And whenever you came back from the market, you had to do this ritual washing of your hands. Not a bad idea, I think, hygiene and stuff. But also, it's not a sin not to wash your hands, right? But they saw Jesus' disciples eating without washing their hands. And they got upset about this. And they said to Jesus, "Why are your disciples not obeying our traditions?" And Jesus basically told them, like, you guys are hypocrites. You're more interested in your traditions than you are in the law of God. And then it says, then he called the crowd to him and said, "Listen and understand. What defiles a person is not what goes into the mouth. It is what comes out of the mouth that defiles a person." Afterwards, his disciples come to him and they're like, "The Pharisees were actually quite offended by what you said. Do you realize that?" And Jesus says to his disciples, basically, don't worry about them. They don't get it. They're blind. They're going to fall in a pit. Unfortunately, the disciples didn't really get it either. And so maybe Peter was worried that he might fall in this pit as well. And so he says to Jesus, "What was your parable? Like, what were you saying? What did you mean by this?" And Jesus says to him, "Even after all this, are you still so foolish? How do you not get it? Don't you understand that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and then goes in the toilet, right? It can't defile you. But the things that come out of the mouth, which are, it's not vomiting, words, right? Speaking. The things that come out of the mouth come from the heart. And these things defile a person. For out of the heart comes evil ideas, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are the things that defile a person. It's not eating with unwashed hands. What's the point? Well, there's lots of stuff in there, but what's Jesus' main point?
What you say can defile you.
Why? Yeah, that's the key. That's the point that he's making, is that the words that you use is actually a reflection of your heart. Right? If your heart is wicked, then the things that you say are probably going to
Also be wicked.
be too. And if you go back to Proverbs 18, what does that likely mean that your words will bring? Death. However, the more you are sanctified, what does it mean to be sanctified? Like?
Jesus.
Yeah, it's being conformed into the image of Jesus. It's being made like Jesus. The more you're sanctified, the more your heart starts to reflect God's heart. What should that result in?
Life. Right?
Why? Because your
words.
Yeah, your words are a reflection of your heart, right? So the more your heart starts to reflect God's heart, the more your words will start to reflect God's heart. And the more your words start to reflect God's heart, the more your words are going to start to bring life, right? Rather than death. This idea that your words, that the way that you speak, the things that you say are a reflection of your heart, is something that is talked about throughout the book of Proverbs, which we've spent a lot of time in during this study. The lips of the righteous know what is pleasing, but the speech of the wicked is perverse. Same idea, right? Somebody who's righteous, that's sanctified. And the words that they say are going to be pleasing, but the speech of the wicked is perverse. Proverbs 14:3, in the speech of a fool is a rod for his back, but the words of the wise protect them. What does that mean?
Does that just mean like
What would a rod for the back be? What's it talking about?
spine?
Sorry?
Spine?
Spine? No.
More current like thinking.
Yeah. There's actually another proverb. I should have added it. It was quite funny. It was like something along the lines of like the lips of a fool, or like something like fools tend to get into arguments, start arguments. They tend to start arguments, and their words invite a punch to the mouth, something like that. Like basically you can get hit in the face Anyway, it's basically the same thing, right? Like a foolish person, a wicked person, and the things that they say, they actually bring punishment on themselves. A rod for the back. You're getting beaten. Death, if you like. But the words of the wise bring protection. Okay? And then righteous lips are the delight of kings. And he loves the one who speaks what is right. And to me, like, Esther is so beautifully reflected in these proverbs. The words that she used when she addressed the king were chosen so wisely, right? Grant me my life and the lives of my people. We've been sold to destruction. If we'd only been sold as slaves, I wouldn't have worried you about this, right? It wouldn't have been important enough. There's so much humility and grace in the way that she responds to the king. And as a consequence, her words were, if not a delight to him, at least received favorably. And they brought protection for her and for her people. which I think that tells us a little bit about Esther's character. That she was probably in the camp of the righteous, because the words that she used reflected that kind of heart. Now, it's not just what we say that matters, it also matters how we say it. In 1 Peter 3, Peter says, "Set Christ apart as Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks about the hope you possess." This verse, if you guys have heard the term, I might have used it, apologetics, it comes from this verse. The word give an answer in Greek is apologia, and it means a defense. So when people ask you about what you believe, be ready to answer them, to give them an answer, to give them a defense of what you believe. And like I said, the word in the Greek is apologia, and that's been used as a term in Christian circles of apologetics. It's having an answer to the questions that people have about our faith. Yeah? So, Peter says you should always be ready to give an answer. But, he says, do it with courtesy and respect. Courtesy is like gentleness, humility, and respectfulness. The way that we say things matters as much as what we say. And again, to me, that's Esther all over, at least in this response to the king. There's so much gentleness, humility, and respect in the way that she speaks to King Xerxes. And then there's one more verse I want to look at from Paul. He says, "Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should answer everyone." This is where I got sidetracked for a few hours, or maybe more than that, trying to figure out what on earth Paul means when he says that our speech should be seasoned with salt. What do you guys think that means?
Tastes good.
Okay. Tastes good. I quite like that.
If you ask someone these days seasoned with salt, being salty is normally being bitter. That seems quite counterintuitive.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's a pretty modern term.
What does that mean? So yes, one of the places that most of the commentaries I looked at, it's fairly obvious, right? It immediately in your mind links back to Jesus' words where he says, "You are the salt of the earth." But what does that mean? But if salt loses its saltiness, it's useless. Throw it out in the road and people walk on it. I don't know actually. But so it does it certainly links back to Jesus' words, but what did Jesus mean when he said, "You are the salt of the earth"?
You make the earth interesting. Make it give it flavor. I don't know.
Yeah.
Flavorful. Make the earth flavorful. Tastes good. So one of the things that salt does is it makes food taste better. Do you know what else salt does?
Dries things out. You can cure a hand with salt.
What are you doing when you cure something?
Preserving it.
Preserve it. Okay. What does it mean to preserve something?
Makes it last long. Keep it
Stops it from doing what?
going off,
Decaying and rotting and going off. So generally what I've seen in terms of explanations of what Jesus means when he says we are the salt of the earth, that's generally the perspective that people have had, is that we are supposed to be a preserving influence in the world, right? To try to slow the decay, if you like. Yeah? How would you do that? Think about your group of friends maybe. How can you be salt amongst your group of friends? Yeah? So probably in the things you say to them, right? And then trying to like keep them from going completely off the rails maybe. Yeah. So I think we definitely have that preserving influence. And so most of the commentaries I saw with regards to what Paul's saying here, that we should speak with grace, seasoned with salt, that the idea was that preserving, that in the words that we use, they should be wholesome and encourage away from decay, right? From our speech and other people's speech going rotten. Okay, so that was interesting. However, there was something else that came up which I thought was quite interesting, because that's not all that salt does. Salt does also flavor. As you said, today we can talk about people being salty. Turns out the ancient Greeks and Romans also talked about people being salty. But they meant something slightly different when they used the word. They were referring to wit and humor. There's actually a term that still today, I found there's, I think, a clothing company or something that call themselves Attic salt. And it's derived from there's a place called, the area that the Athens, where they inhabited in Greece, was called Attica. And they were apparently known for their sense of humor and their clever, quick wit. And so Attic salt was basically Athenian wit. And this shows up, I didn't actually include that in here, but there's a whole bunch of people, ancient Greek writers, Roman writers, who refer to, they call people salty, or they've got good salt, and it means they're clever, they've got good wit. And there's one guy who talks about black salt. Yeah, dark humor. Anyway, so it's quite interesting. So it's not impossible that what Paul's doing here is, and maybe it's a pun, maybe he's drawing on both. It's drawing from like the sort of colloquial like a contemporary idiom, something that everybody in his time understood, salt to be like lightness, a bit of humor, a little bit of wit, that it's okay to use a little bit of that in your... Be gracious, but it's okay to be a little bit funny as well. Makes it taste better. Not too much salt, because you don't want to be too salty, but a little bit of salt can make things a lot more enjoyable. Okay, so anyway, big sidetrack. Like I said, it was a big sidetrack for me. Much more importantly, our speech should be gracious. That's the important part. Kind, considerate, joyful even, like the background to the word grace is actually joy. Now, Esther wasn't exactly joyful in this moment, but she was definitely gracious in the words that she used with Xerxes, and we're encouraged to be gracious, kind, considerate, respectful, and maybe a little bit salty as well. Okay. And then, something else. We're not going to get nearly as far as I thought.
Still gonna leave it
It's a short service, though.
How are you still gonna leave it?
I don't know. Okay. Something else that I think is like courageous and really quite heroic in Esther's response here is Esther's interceding. What does it mean to intercede? Get in the middle of something, right? Get involved. What it really means is plead on behalf of somebody else in this context, right? There's an issue going on and you're getting in there, you're pleading the case of the one side. It's kind of like what a lawyer does. Now, you can intercede from a safe distance, which is kind of what a lawyer does, right? They're pleading the case of their client in front of the judge, but they're not actually personally invested. Whatever the judge decides doesn't affect them, right? Nice safe distance. Esther could in theory have done that, right? She could have come to the king and said, this is the situation. You have this innocent Jewish people. I'm not involved here, right? But they have this situation and it's unjust and you should please intervene in this situation, right? She could have interceded, pleaded in that way, keeping herself carefully out of the situation so that worst case scenario, even if the Jews can't be saved, maybe she can escape.
It probably makes her argument more powerful to admit that she's a Jew, because it's obviously, she's
I absolutely agree. And that's exactly what she does. She says, we have been sold, both I and my people, to destruction, slaughter, and annihilation. She puts herself into that situation too, right? She makes their problem her problem. She's not the only example of that in the Bible. You have Moses up the mountain with God, receiving God's law. Down the bottom, what's happening? The rest of the Israelites have created themselves an idol, a golden calf that they're worshipping. God, up on the mountain with Moses, tells Moses what's going on down there. And he basically tells Moses, get out of the way, I'm going to wipe them out. And I'm going to make a new nation out of you. Moses says, you can't do that. Imagine what the Egyptians will say, right? After all you did for this people, saving them from Egypt, only to kill them in the desert, that will reflect badly on you. You can't do that. He does. And so God says, okay, fine. But he sends Moses down there to see for himself. And when Moses gets there and actually sees what's going on down there, he smashes the tablets, he's furious, but he's also, I think, realizes that how bad things actually are and that God would be completely justified to do what he had said he was going to do, though I believe he never actually intended to do. And so then Moses goes back up the mountain and it says, he returned to the Lord and said, oh, what a terrible sin these people have committed. They have made gods of gold for themselves. But now, if you will only forgive their sin, but if not, erase my name from the record you have written. Do you see what he's doing? This is intercession, right? He's going before the Lord and pleading on behalf of the Jewish people. But he's not doing it from a safe distance. He's making himself part of their problem. He's basically saying to God, if you won't forgive them, if you're going to destroy them, you have to destroy me too, right? Esther's basically the same situation. Esther's saying to Xerxes, you need to save the Jewish people. And if you don't save them, I'm going to die too. She's making their problem her problem, right? Same as Moses. But in Hebrews, we're told the law is only a shadow of the good things to come, not the reality itself. The law is the Old Testament. It's a shadow. Moses is in his intercession for the Jewish people is a shadow, a picture of what? Yeah, who have we got interceding for us before God? Absolutely. He is able to save, Jesus, completely those who come to him through God because he always lives to intercede for them. Jesus is interceding on our behalf. He's pleading on our behalf before the Father. But, as you say, didn't do that from a safe distance. In Isaiah, we've looked at this, Isaiah 53, like this amazing, majestic passage. It's called the Holy of Holies of the Old Testament. It's where it says, we all like sheep have gone astray, each of us have, yeah? But the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. Amazing, amazing passage, written 500 years before Jesus. God says, I will assign him, Jesus, a portion with the great. He will divide the spoils of victory with the powerful. Because he willingly submitted to death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and interceded on behalf of the transgressor. God will make Jesus great because he chose to be numbered with the transgressors. Again, Jesus doesn't intercede for us from a distance. He chose to become part of the problem, to join us in our fallen, in our broken state, right? And then ultimately to, in doing so, become our salvation. And so actually, Esther here, in interceding for her people and making herself a part of their problem, is a picture of Jesus, which is pretty cool. Do you think Haman's put 2 and 2 together? Does he know what's going on here?
Yes.
You think so?
Actually, I don't know if Haman knows Esther.
Well, that's the question. Does she know that Esther's related to Mordecai? If she does, he knows that Esther's Jewish, in which case he'd join the dots pretty quickly. But I suspect from verses later on, the king didn't know that Esther and Mordecai were related. I suspect Haman didn't know that that Mordecai and Esther were related, which means I don't think Haman knew that Esther was Jewish.
So he wouldn't have a clue.
So don't know, but you can imagine his mind start working. Her and her people have been sold to destruction. You don't suppose that starts to dawn on him, is the queen Jewish?
Like, if he knew, I almost wonder if he would have asked him to lie in the first place.
That is a good question. I didn't talk about that at the time, but there is the question. Esther kept her Jewishness secret. You do wonder whether all of this would have been avoided if she hadn't tried to hide her identity. Because would Haman have had we'll see in a little bit, the presumption, the arrogance to plot to kill the queen? And that has, you can think about the applications for yourself as Christians and maybe what the consequence of keeping your identity secret. Okay, anyway, so we'll stop there. Another cliffhanger to be continued in 2 weeks' time, which is not ideal. Yeah. Okay, let's pray quickly and then we'll go. In fairness, that was a short service. Just saying. Okay. Lord God, thank you so much for your word, for your promises, Lord, and so much for not leaving us. And we're all in this mess of a situation, Lord, separated from you and with pretty terrible consequences coming late, when this life is over, Lord. I thank you that you didn't leave us in that situation, that you chose to become a part of the problem so that you could ultimately be our solution. And I ask that you would help each of us to more and more appreciate exactly what it is you've done for us in making us yours and saving us, and giving us your righteousness, Lord, and bringing us into your family. And I ask that also in all of our lives, you would more and more sanctify us, that you would make our hearts more like you, Lord, and that the words that we use would be gracious, seasoned with salt, but that they would bring life in our lives and in the people around us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.